Welcome to today's discussion on tissues, specifically on histology. In this presentation, which I'm going to chunk up into three shorter presentations, you're going to be learning some greater overview, some overarching ideas about tissues and membranes, but then you're also going to be hearing once again about epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous tissues. These are all topics that you've already been tested on and seen extensively in Lab 2. And this presentation should really be a recapitulation, a restating, an opportunity for you to put a few pieces into place that perhaps didn't completely click during the lab. The same tissues that you are responsible for in the lab are the same tissues that you are responsible for here. So this should all sound very familiar when I get into the actual tissue types, their locations, and their special features. So let's get started. In this first presentation, I'm going to cover 4.1 and 4.2. We'll cover through epithelial tissues. Then there'll be a second video that deals just with connective tissues. And then the third and final video for today will be covering muscle, nervous tissue, and tissue injury. There's a little bit of the tissue injury section that I have blued out because you are not responsible for it. So let's get started taking a look at the types of tissues. Now, you already know this. You know that in the body there are at least 200 different types of cells. Some counts as many as 220 distinct different cell types. And you know that each of those cells is a separate living thing in your body. And we're now moving up the hierarchy in that cells combine to make tissues, right? Cells combine to make tissues. And there are four basic types of tissues in the body, right? Tissues are a group of cells that are found together. They work in a common job, if you will. And cells within a tissue share a common embryologic origin. And we'll go through that in a few minutes. So the study of tissues is called histology. And this is the term you'll hear a lot about. Remember, cytology is the study of cells, and histology is the study of tissues. Let's remind ourselves what those four basic types of tissues are. Number one, epithelial tissues. Epithelial tissues. When you think about epithelial tissues, your mind should be thinking about four different places. Number one, the outer layer of your body, right? Your skin, your epidermis. Secondly, epithelial tissues are found lining all of your tube-like structures in all of your body cavities. Recall from Lab 1, you learned about the thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic cavity, and you learned about the serous membranes that line those cavities. Serous membranes are epithelial. Finally, you would find epithelial tissues as the major component of glands. So your thyroid gland, your pancreas, the liver, these organs are primarily, these glandular organs are primarily made up of epithelial tissues. Now the second type of tissue are connective tissues. Now this is the most broad group of tissues, as you saw in lab. Some of these tissues are holding things together. Some of these tissues are supporting. Some of them are, for example, your bones and your cartilage are very structural. And then you have liquid connective tissues like blood and lymph. So connective tissues, very broad category of tissues. Muscle tissues, right? What makes muscle tissue special? Recall, muscle tissues move, right? They are contractile. They are excitable. All that means is that when a muscle cell and muscle tissues get excited from the nervous system, they respond, and they respond by shortening, by contracting. So what is the common feature of all muscle tissue is that it moves. And recall there are three major types of muscle tissue, and we'll talk about each of these later. But there is skeletal muscle. This is the kind of muscle you find in your muscles that you move. There's smooth muscle. This is the kind of muscle that is surrounding your intestines and your bladder and all of your internal structures. And then there's cardiac muscle found exclusively in the heart. And then finally, there's nervous tissue. And this is the one that we'll spend the least amount of time on now. But nervous tissue, like muscle tissue, is excitable. But when nervous tissue gets excited, it sends electrical signals. So those electrical signals are traveling very, very quickly throughout the body, sending signals for muscles to contract, sending signals for glands to secrete, all of those sorts of things. And then remember that when we combine multiple tissues, that we get organs. So in our hierarchy, we go from tissues to organs. And when we get to chapter 5 and beyond, we'll be discussing organs and organ systems. So let's just take a quick view of the body here. And your number one job in this whole histology unit, and histology is an important part of exam 1, is to, 1, recognize the various tissues. What would they look like under the microscope? You've seen that in lab. You're going to see it again here briefly. Know where those tissues are located in your body, and know and be able to identify any of the special features that are highlighted in lab and as I highlight again through today's presentation. So epithelial tissues, again, covering your body, covering your internal organs, lining your body cavities, and your glands of your body are primarily epithelial. Connective tissue, you know from lab, connective tissues include fat, bone, cartilage, tendons, ligaments, blood, and this other weird thing called dense and loose connective tissue. So those are all examples of connective tissue. Muscle tissue, already mentioned the three types: cardiac, smooth, and skeletal. And then finally, there is nervous tissue. This tissue is found throughout your body, but there's a very large concentration of it within your brain and spinal cord. So I mentioned that tissues, each of the different types of tissues comes from distinct embryological layers. Let me introduce those layers to you. And recall that at the beginning of our life cycle, right, the zygote is formed. The zygote is the fertilized egg. So when egg and sperm come together, we form the zygote. That zygote is going to undergo rapid mitotic cycles. It's going to form 2 cells, 4 cells, 8 cells, 16 cells. And those cells, recall from our previous presentation, are called totipotent because those cells can become anything. Those totipotent cells will reach the uterus, and then the embryo will implant into the uterus. And recall then the cells become a little bit more specialized, they differentiate, and some of the cells become pluripotent and eventually multipotent and oligopotent and eventually at the end unipotent. How does this happen? In the early embryo, shortly after the embryo attaches to the uterus, the early embryo divides into 3 distinct layers. 3 distinct layers. And these 3 distinct layers are called the germ layers. Not germs like things that make us sick, but germ layers. And there are 3 of these germ layers. Number 1, the early embryo has an outer layer called the ectoderm. Ecto means outer. There is a middle layer called the mesoderm. Meso means middle. And there's an inner layer called the endoderm, and endo means inner, right? So we have an outer, a middle, and an inner layer. And it turns out that our tissues come from different layers. So let's take a look. The ectoderm, the outer layer of the early embryo, goes on to form the epidermis. And that makes sense, doesn't it? That the outer layer of the early embryo would become the outer layer of our body. All over from head to foot, our outer layer of our skin is called the epidermis. The ectoderm, though, and what maybe doesn't make sense to you, is also what goes on to make your nervous system. Your brain and spinal cord are formed from the ectoderm. Now notice there are a number of other things that are listed here that come from the ectoderm. But what I want you to know, click on this a little bit larger, what I want you to know is that the ectoderm forms your outer layer of your skin called the epidermis and goes on to form the brain, right? The nervous system. So that is your neurons, your spinal cord, and your brain. The other things are really cool, but they're not something I'm going to ask you to know. The mesoderm, the middle layer, goes on to form a multitude. This is how I remember it. The mesoderm goes on to form a multitude of tissues, all of your connective tissues. All of your connective tissues come from the mesoderm. So bone, cartilage, blood, all of it comes from the mesoderm. In addition, from the mesoderm, you also get muscle. So all of your muscles. So connective tissues and muscle. That's what I want you to remember. Okay? For the mesoderm, connective tissues and muscle tissues. And then finally, the endoderm, the inside layer. And to me, this makes sense. The inside layer forms all of the inside tube things in your body. So the endoderm goes on to form the lining, the airways of your respiratory system, down your trachea and down into your lungs. And the endoderm goes on to form your digestive system, all the tubes going down your esophagus into your intestines and stomach. All of that is also part or derived from the endoderm. Okay, so those are the features, those are the important tissues that I want you to know, and layers and structures that are formed from these three different germ layers. When we're discussing tissues, there's another important thing to keep track of, and that is membranes. Membranes. There's four different kinds of membranes in your body. One of them you've already heard of. The other ones I'll introduce here, and you'll continue to hear about them as we go through the course. The first we'll discuss are tissue membranes. And first we have two different kinds of membranes. There are connective tissue membranes and there are epithelial tissue type membranes. Let's talk about one. Well, here are the four. Let's talk about the four first. The one that you've already been introduced to are the serous membranes. Recall from Lab 1 that inside your body there are three serous membranes. And there's a serous membrane called the peritoneum, one that's called the pleura, one that's called the pericardium. These serous membranes are epithelial layers, and recall they surround the internal organs. These are the ones you know. You've been introduced to the serous membranes. You also have heard a little bit about mucous membranes. Now, mucous membranes are basically the openings to the outside of your body. So the mucous membranes are the lining inside your mouth. inside your nose, inside your urethra, and inside your anus and reproductive structures. Okay? So basically, mucous membranes open to the outside world. Serous membranes are completely enclosed within the body. You cannot touch a serous membrane. They are embedded within your body, whereas mucous membranes, you can touch all of them. I always think a mucous membrane is anywhere where you put Tabasco sauce and it burns. I'll let you imagine that. But inside your nose, inside your mouth, and other places where you have mucous membranes, Tabasco sauce isn't going to feel so good. Okay? So that's the way I remember mucous membranes. In addition, the other two types of membranes. One, cutaneous membrane. That is simply a fancy name for your skin. Your skin that covers from head to toe all over your body, that is your cutaneous membrane. And lastly, there are synovial membranes. These are membranes that we will find later on in the course surround joint structures, for example, around the knee. And within that synovial membrane, there is fluid. And that fluid helps to lubricate and keep your joints healthy and moistened. So those are the synovial membranes, and they are found in all, not all, but most of your joint spaces have synovial membranes associated with them. So of these four membrane types, connective tissue membrane, right? Connective tissue membrane is solely made up of connective tissue, and this is the synovial membrane. So the synovial membrane is 100% connective tissue. Again, it surrounds your joint structures, as is shown here in this video for the knee, and it allows fluid to circulate around that joint structure. That helps to maintain the health of the joint, helps to maintain lubrication as well. So that's the connective tissue membrane. And then the last three are epithelial-based membranes. So for example, the mucous membranes, again, really is sort of a combination of connective tissue and epithelial tissue. Again, mucous membranes open to the outside world. The trachea would be a good example of that. Serous membranes, again, these are the membranes found deep in your body. They are made up of epithelial tissues as well. And this is your pleura, your pericardium, and your peritoneum. And then finally, the skin is the cutaneous membrane, and you know from lab already that the outer layer of the skin is composed of stratified, squamous, keratinized epithelium. So that helps to produce the cutaneous membrane. And now below the epidermis, there's the dermis, right? And that dermis is connective tissue. So those are the four different types of membranes. This is a great question. Compare and contrast the location of mucous and serous membranes. So again, these questions are really important for you to stop and consider and think about. Once you type in your response, hit submit, and that not only will send your response to me and be part of your participation grade, but also your response will be here the next time that you look through your book as a way of studying. So that brings us to the end of this introduction to what tissues are, to the end of 4.1. Recall at the end, there are some questions for you to answer and some vocabulary for you to consider. Also, let me just say once again, there are places in here for you to type notes. This is a great place. Submit it. That way it'll save. And these notes are a place where you can record a note for an SI instructor or for a lab instructor or for me if something is not making sense for you. Recall also that you can simply leave notes within the text, right? You can simply add a note to yourself, and you can also save that note also as a way of recalling questions that you might have. So let's now go to epithelial tissues, and let's take a look. Again, you are only responsible for the same epithelial tissues that were introduced in lab. Now, you know from lab that epithelial tissues, again, are made up of layers of cells, either one layer, right? One layer, simple epithelia, or multiple layers of cells. You know that these cells come in different shapes: squamous, columnar, cuboidal. And you know that they form barriers, right? Epithelial tissues form barriers. They stop things. They create, dividers in the body. Think those serous membranes. And they also, as we've said, are the major component in glands where they secrete something. So breast tissue is basically glandular, it's epithelial. The pancreas that secretes things is largely epithelial. Now, epithelial cells come from all three embryologic layers. I did not say that before. Okay, but let me go back and say that. Let me go back to that initial table and make sure that makes sense to you. In this table, I told you that the ectoderm, the outer layer, forms your epidermis and your nervous system. Well, the epidermis, do you agree, is epithelial. That's on the outside of your body. The mesoderm, I told you, makes connective tissues and muscle tissues. But adding to that, the mesoderm also makes your serous membranes. Your serous membranes. Okay, so mesoderm makes the serous membranes. Serous membranes are epithelial. They are made up of simple squamous epithelia. And then finally, the endoderm, not only does it make the linings or the airways and the digestive system, but it also makes the epithelial cells that line those airways. So the cells that line down the trachea, that line down the stomach and the intestine and down the esophagus, even the cells that line our blood vessels, all of those cells are derived from the endoderm. So, recap. Epithelial tissues are made from all three germ layers. Connective and muscle tissues are made exclusively from mesoderm. And the nervous tissue is made exclusively from the ectoderm. So let's take a look. Now, you know that epithelial cells are tightly bound together in making epithelial tissues. That means there has to be something that is holding these cells together in a very tight arrangement so that these epithelial layers and these tissues can form. Remember also from lab the characteristics of epithelial tissues. They are highly cellular. They have little to no extracellular matrix, and the cells are tightly packed together. How are they held together? Oh, the other thing you learned in lab is that epithelial cells have a polarity. In other words, the cells have a north and a south pole. Those are my words. But they have a top and a bottom polarity or orientation. The top of the cell is always called the apical side. That's the side that's always facing toward the outside of the body or facing the inside of a tube. And then there's the basal side of cells, and this is the side that is sitting on the connective tissue below or is facing away from the outer surface. There's a basement membrane. Remember, the basement membrane is the connector or the separator between the epithelial and the connective tissues below. The basement membrane is actually composed of two layers. The basement membrane is partly made up of what's called the basal lamina. You'll see this in a moment. The basal lamina is epithelial, and below that there is the reticular lamina, and this is the underlying connective tissue. So essentially the basement membrane is a combination of epithelial and connective tissues that combine to make that barrier between them, or the connection place between them. Another feature of epithelial tissues, you know from lab, is that epithelial tissues are nearly, not completely, but nearly avascular, meaning that there are very, very few blood vessels that come up into the epithelial layers. Very, very few. Now, in the lab, I believe it was described that epithelial tissues are completely avascular, and that is more true than not. Okay. And finally, epithelial tissues are constantly replacing themselves. They have a very high turnover, they have a relatively short life cycle, and they are completing mitosis faster than most other cells. So we know a little bit about epithelial cells and epithelial tissues. So again, epithelial cells have a orientation, a polarity, and you're also seeing that epithelial cells, some of them have cilia, and some of them have microvilli. When there are cilia, they are going to be present on the apical surface, on the outer surface. So what's the purpose of cilia, and what tissues have you been shown? What epithelial tissues did you see in lab that have cilia? And the one that we showed you in lab is the pseudostratified columnar epithelium that has cilia. And this tissue was located, do you remember where? It was located in the airways. It was located down the trachea. And pseudostratified columnar epithelium with cilia is also the type of epithelium that you find in the nasal passages, right up in your nose. So how do the epithelial cells get connected to each other? What is it that holds them together tightly? There are a number of different cell-to-cell junctions. These are basically protein connectors that hold the cells together. So in these pictures, what we're seeing are two epithelial cells sitting side by side. And what we notice is that there are proteins that link those tissues together. Tight junctions, just like they describe, are tightly bound or tightly binding two epithelial cells together. Tight junctions are found very much toward the outside edge, toward the apical surface that is shown here, right? So tight junctions are right here. Now, what tight junctions do, and what all of these cell-to-cell junctions do, is they prevent molecules from being able to pass down between the cells. Remember, epithelial tissues create barriers, and we want those barriers to be able to withstand, right, the invasion of things. So we want to have tightly connected cells so that molecules cannot pass between the cells. The other is gap junctions. Now notice that gap junctions are further down. They're not up at the apical surface. They're more down along the middle or even more toward the basal side of the surface. Gap junctions, as the name suggests, actually are tunnels. They allow molecules to pass through. This is how epithelial cells are able to share nutrients, how they're able to share other chemical signals. Molecules are able to travel from one cell directly into the next cell. The little proteins that make these gap junctions are called connexons, right? Because they connect the cells one to another. Over here under tight junctions, there's also a structure called an anchoring junction, and we'll look at those here. Anchoring junctions come in two basic flavors. One, desmosomes. Desmosomes are basically like the rivets that you find on your jeans. They kind of look like a button. Okay, they kind of look like a button. Each of the cells provides half of the button, connected in between by proteins. And you're going to find desmosomes in tissues that are under a lot of stress. So there are going to be a lot of desmosomes in the epithelial cells, tissues of the anus. As you defecate, right, there's stress being put on the cells. You're going to find desmosomes in the cardiac muscle, in the heart, as the heart is contracting. It is under a lot of stress. You're going to find more desmosomes in the vagina. You're going to find more desmosomes in the esophagus. I guess any tissue, any epithelial line tissue where there's extra stress. So think of desmosomes like the rivets on the pockets of your jeans, right? And why did they put those rivets on those jean pockets? Again, as you're sticking things in and out of your pocket, there's some extra stress, and those rivets are helping to withstand that stress. And finally, there are hemidesmosomes. Hemidesmosomes are found between the basement membrane and the cell above it. Hemidesmosomes are found a lot in skin. And you probably never thought about this, but when you get into your car and you slide your butt across the seat of your car, you don't leave cells behind, right? You don't lose layers of cells off your butt. I wish I could. But you don't lose layers of cells off your butt when you slide across a bench or across a couch, because the layers of those epithelial cells in your skin are being held down to the lower levels through these hemidesmosomes. And as the name suggests, they are half a button, right? So desmosomes are two halves of the rivet or two halves of the button. Hemidesmosomes are just half of it. And they are found on the basal side of these cell layers. So pictures are here. A little bit of a discussion here, what I've described. And just make sure you can recognize those different sorts of junctions. Hold these epithelial tissues together. Now, this part should seem very, very familiar to you. You know that we can name or classify or describe epithelial tissues based upon two very important characteristics. Number one, how many cells are there in the tissue? And you know that if there's one layer of cells, we call that a simple epithelium. If there are two or more layers of cells, that is referred to as a stratified epithelium. Then the second characteristic is the shape of the cells, the primary shape of the cells. So simple squamous is one layer of very flat cells, squishy, squashy, squamous. Simple cuboidal, one layer of cells that are like little cubes, little squares. Simple columnar, one layer of tall column-like cells. Versus stratified squamous, many, many layers of cells, and the squamous is named in response to the outer layer. So we see here at the apical layer that the cells are very, very thin, hence its name. Don't worry that down here the cells look more cuboidal. These tissues are named, stratified tissues are named after their apical, their top layer. Stratified cuboidal, right? Two layers of cube-like cells. Stratified columnar, again, this particular diagram is showing three layers of cells, but note the top layer are the tall columnar-like, so we don't worry about the shape of the lower, deeper layers. We only look at the most apical layer in naming stratified tissues. Of these 6, only 4 are part of your learning. We are not this semester learning any stratified cuboidal or stratified columnar tissues. So the only 4 here that are going to apply to what we're doing this semester: simple squamous, simple cuboidal, simple columnar, and stratified squamous. So simple epithelia, as a general rule, one layer of cells, and these tissues are very thin, and they make for an important divider, but simple epithelia also allow molecules to move across. So what do we find in our lungs? Where do we, down in the alveoli where gas exchange happens, right? That's where we find simple squamous. In your kidneys, where you're filtering the blood, we find simple epithelium. In the lining of your capillaries, where you drop off, blood and when you drop off nutrients and oxygen, also we find simple epithelium. So simple epithelium, wherever it's a very thin layer, and typically things can move across that rather easily. I mentioned that epithelia are formed from all three layers, all three germ layers. The epithelia that are found from the endoderm are also called the endothelium. So the endothelium is the epithelial tissue derived from that inner layer. Mesothelium is the special extra name given to the epithelial tissues that are derived from the mesoderm, from the middle layer of the early embryo. Mesothelium is also a code word for the serous membrane. So mesothelium and serous membranes, those are synonymous terms. Okay, so the pleura, the peritoneum, and the pericardium, the three serous membranes, are also referred to as mesothelia. Mesothelia. Simple cuboidal. Oh, let me go back. So when it comes to these tissues, let's go through it. So simple squamous. I didn't say it just now. Simple squamous, one layer, flat cells. We find simple squamous, the endothelium inside your blood vessels. That is a single layer of flat cells. So your endothelium is also a simple squamous epithelium. Your serous membranes are also a simple squamous epithelium. So endothelia and mesothelia are also, by shape and classification, simple squamous epithelia. Simple cuboidal epithelium, recall in lab, the main place that you find simple cuboidal is in the kidney tubules. We'll dive into the kidneys a lot more when we get to the urinary system, but your kidneys are in the business of filtering your blood in order to make urine. And there are a lot of molecules that move in and out of your kidney tubules as urine is being produced. So it makes sense that the kidneys would be full of a simple epithelium that allow molecules to move in and out and across that simple epithelium. And then simple columnar epithelium, the main place that you saw this epithelium in the lab was lining a large part of the digestive system, specifically in the intestines. So in the intestines, you have simple columnar epithelium. Again, this is, think about what your intestines do. Your intestines are in the business of absorbing nutrients. So we don't want there to be a thick layer between your gut tube and the ability of your body to absorb these nutrients. So the intestines have a simple columnar epithelium, and the special feature here is that these simple columnar epithelia have microvilli on their apical surface. Microvilli, their job are to increase the surface area so that the intestines can quickly and easily absorb more nutrients out of the food that passes through. In lab last week, you saw the pre-lab video. I drew on histological images during that. This should all be feeling comfortable. You may want to also be referring back to your green lab manual as you work through this material, and make sure that you are watching these videos. They are great in giving you that visual understanding of these tissues. So in addition to simple squamous, simple columnar, and simple cuboidal, there is that kind of weird type of epithelium called pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium. This is actually a simple epithelium, but it appears to be stratified. So at first glance, it looks to have multiple layers of cells. But if you could go in and closely examine the cells, you would see that all of the cells in this type of tissue has direct connection to the basement membrane. So it's really one layer of cells. It looks kind of ragged. It kind of looks stratified, but that's why it's called pseudo-stratified. And pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium is found in the respiratory tract and most oftentimes has cilia associated with it. Do you remember what other cell type is present in pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium? And if you said goblet cells, you're correct. So goblet cells, remember, are the mucus-producing cells that are found. So here in this cartoon, this is a goblet cell. I know it doesn't necessarily scream at you, but it is going to be releasing this mucus. And notice there's no cilia on this cell. So this actually, although it's not labeled, this cell and even this cell represent goblet cells that can produce the mucus. And there is a reminder of those goblet cells. Okay. Now the other place where goblet cells are present, didn't mention it earlier, but in the simple columnar epithelium lining your intestines, you have goblet cells as well. So remember, goblet cells are producing mucus. Mucus is going to keep your intestines moist. You don't want a dry, creaky intestine, right? You want a moist intestine so that the food, as it's passing through, can slide through easily. And you also, in the intestines, remember we have microvilli, and that microvilli increases the surface area so that you can quickly absorb those nutrients as they pass through. So those are the simple epithelium. The stratified epithelium that you need to learn for this semester include stratified squamous epithelium. Now, you know that there are two flavors of this. Stratified squamous epithelium comes in two flavors, keratinized and non-keratinized. I'll mention that again in a minute. In your skin, right, in the outer layer of your skin, the layer you know as the epidermis, that is keratinized. But inside your mouth, it's moist. It's not dead and dry. It's moist. And inside your mouth, the cells have not dried up and released and made a lot of keratin. So those are non-keratinized, stratified squamous epithelia lining your mucous membranes. Right? So your mucous membranes, the entryway into your mouth, entryway into the anus, entryway into the vagina, those are made up of non-keratinized stratified squamous. There are stratified cuboidal and stratified columnar epithelia in your body, but recall, we are not learning about that this semester, so we'll put a blue over that. You don't need to worry about stratified cuboidal or columnar epithelium. Now the last and final type of epithelium, another is kind of a specialized one. It is, though, a stratified epithelium, and that is transitional epithelium. And it's called transitional epithelium because it transitions. It is found primarily in the urinary system, specifically lining the inside of the bladder and inside the ureters. Those are the tubes that carry the urine from the kidneys down to the bladder. And basically, as the bladder fills and empties, the bladder stretches and gets distended. and this epithelium stretches with the bladder, hence its name, transitional epithelium. So whereas the Blossom textbook depends primarily on videos, your green lab manual included the actual histological images. They're both important, so make sure that you're using all of your resources to learn your histology. Here's a nice little table that reminds us of the different types of epithelium. And what's nice about this is it reminds you of where these different tissues are located. This is exactly what you need to know. And you'll also see that the three simple epithelia, right, are all about passing molecules, secreting and absorbing, very thin layers. Whereas the stratified epithelium are more about protection, protection, protection. The other place that you find epithelial tissues are your glands. We've said that. Let me show you a little bit more about this. In your body, there are basically two kinds of glands. There are endocrine glands and there are exocrine glands. Vocabulary helps us with this. Endo means within. Exo means outside. And crine or crine means to secrete. To secrete. So just by that, you know that the endocrine glands secrete products within the body, whereas exocrine glands secrete products out of the body. Endocrine glands, you know, are all of the glands that release hormones. Exocrine glands would include things like your sweat glands, your tear glands, your salivary glands that make spit, even your digestive juices made by your stomach and your intestines, because they can be released out of the body, are considered exocrine glands. Now, there's one organ that you'll hear about this semester that actually is both endocrine and exocrine, and that's the pancreas. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that right now, but just appreciate the pancreas. Not only does it release important hormones into the body, think endocrine, but it also releases digestive enzymes into the stomach and the intestines, which are exocrine. So endocrine glands, and we're not going to talk about them very much after this moment right now, but endocrine glands release hormones into the body, into the interstitial fluid, into the bloodstream, into the body itself. Okay? And in comparison to endocrine glands, we have exocrine glands. This is where we're going to be spending our focus right now and in the rest of this conversation. Exocrine glands release their contents into a duct, into a tube, that then leads to an epithelial surface. So again, mucus glands, goblet cells, sweat glands, salivary glands that make saliva, breast milk, all of these are examples of exocrine glands. They all discharge their products through a tube, and that tube then directs those products out of the body or to an epithelial surface. So this video talks about sweat glands as an exocrine gland, and then here another example within the body, another exocrine gland. So make sure again that you're watching these videos. Now, glands come in a whole host of shapes and sizes. I am not going to get all excited about the different types of glands, okay? So I'm going to not worry about these words, tubuloalveolar or tubular acidic glands. Let's not worry about those things. I just want you to see that exocrine glands release their products to the outside world. Here are different types of exocrine glands. Some of them have a series of cells that release their products into a duct, right? They all have a duct. And then some of these glands you see are far more complex. They have a lot more of these little secretion cell regions. And I'm not going to worry about if a gland is a simple or a compound or a tubular or an acinar sort of gland. So don't worry about those terms or those classifications. All I want you to see, let's just zoom into one of these. No matter what kind of exocrine gland you're looking at, there's going to be a series of cells. Those cells are the cells, the epithelial cells, that are going to release their products into the duct, and the duct is going to lead those products to an epithelial surface. And that is true of all of these different types of glands. Okay, so again, this is what your breast glands, your mammary glands, your oil glands of your skin, the glands that make digestive products in the stomach, your other kinds of sweat glands, all of these, right, are all different types of exocrine glands. What I do want you to focus on, though, are the three different methods by which these exocrine glands release their products. Let me go through these with you. The first type of secretion method is called merocrine. It's the most common type in your body. And in merocrine, here are the epithelial cells, and they're releasing their products, right, by exocytosis, right? Remember we learned about exocytosis. They're exocytosing their products into the duct. Imagine the duct is right here, and those products are then being released to the outside world. That's merocrine. Apocrine. Notice something is different here, that a part of the cell actually pinches off and is released into the duct as part of the secretion. What do you call this side of the cell? Remember, down here where the cells are attached to the basement membrane, this is the basal side of the cell, and the top of the cell is called the apical side. So in apocrine secretion, a portion of the apical part of the cell is crine released, right? Apocrine, the apical portion pinches off. And then finally, there's holocrine secretion. And what happens in holocrine secretion is that as the cell is releasing its products, the cell actually releases its entire self. The whole cell dies in the process. Okay, so how do I remember this? In holocrine, the whole cell dies, right? The whole cell will die and becomes the secretory product. In merocrine, the cell stays merry. In other words, the cell stays alive, right? It simply releases its products via exocytosis. And then apocrine kind of tells you what it does. The apical portion of the cell pinches off. Well, what kinds of where in the body do we have these different kinds of secretions? Merocrine, right, is the most common type. This is how you get your watery types of secretions. This is mostly your salivary glands. This is your sweat glands that produce this way. Apocrine is the primary way that you produce, or the body produces, breast milk. Okay? And apocrine is also the way that your underarm regions secrete or sweat. And that sweat, those stinky kinds of sweat that we release from our genital and our axillary regions, are released by this method. And then the holocrine, where the entire cell is destroyed and released with the secretions, this is the primary way that those oily glands in your skin and hair release their products. And this helps to explain why these oil glands get clogged up, because the ducts that lead away from these cells are getting clogged up with these secretions and all of this cellular debris. So it makes a lot more sense, right? Why your oily glands of your body get clogged up and lead to acne sort of things, because of the type of secretion that they do. The method is holocrine. Now, the other feature to know about glandular secretions, in addition to the method, merocrine, apocrine, or holocrine, is the type of secretions. And secretions come in two basic flavors. Okay, they're going to come as, we'll come back to that picture in a minute, but your secretions are either going to be serous, and serous secretions are very watery secretions. Think your serous membranes. Your serous membranes have a watery, lubricating fluid within them. The other kind of secretion is mucus. Think thick, viscous, right? When you wake up in the morning and you sort of have a dry mouth, right? That mucousy sort of secretion. Most glands secrete either serous or they secrete mucus, but there is one example that does both, and that is your salivary glands. You know that when you're hungry, your saliva becomes very watery. As you anticipate the meal, your salivary glands begin to produce spit, and that release is watery as you anticipate the digestive process of breaking down the food, because your saliva contains some of those enzymes. But what happens to your spit when you're scared? And you know that your spit becomes thick. So your salivary glands have the ability of releasing both serous, watery secretions and mucousy, thick secretions. And so we say that the salivary glands are mixed in that they release both of these types of secretions. So know the three methods and know the two different kinds of secretions in the examples that I provided. I mentioned that the glands that are along your hair, right, are these sebaceous glands. Sebaceous glands are oil-producing glands. And I told you also that this is holocrine secretion. So that explains why you get this buildup of stuff and why these can get clogged up as they travel to the surface of the skin as well. So that brings us to the end of epithelial tissues and to this first of three shorter videos. This one covering types of tissues and some different things about tissues and epithelial tissues. Continue on to watch the other videos on connective tissues and the final one on muscle, nervous, and tissue injuries.